Yeah, we're now going to proceed with our second panel, requirements for international trade. And our first speaker will be Dr. Cornelia Furculiță. She's a lecturer at Moldova State University and completed her PhD thesis at the German University of Administrative Science in Speyer, where she also has been a postdoctoral researcher for 2 years, and her research focuses mainly on international trade law, international dispute settlement, and EU trade policy. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I have been already introduced. So today I will present the paper entitled Open, Sustainable and Assertive Trade Policy, No More. So where from did I take the three adjectives? From the 2021 Trade Policy Review, of course. The Trade Policy Review announced that the Commission would pursue an open, sustainable, assertive trade policy, and in my paper I tried to look at some instances to see whether that motto is still the one fit for the reality. So first of all, what open means, according to the Trade Policy Review, it means that Commission with its trade policy will still stay committed to open and fair trade and will continue reaping the benefits of international rules-based trade order, although trying also to pursue the WTO reform. It also promised that its trade policy is going to promote green sustainability, a green transition, favor globalization based on the EU's Green Deal package, and for that it promised and already adopted the CBAM and the EUDR. Finally, it promised to more assertively defend its interests from external economic coercion and unfair trade practices, and more assertively enforce its trade rights. And as our colleagues already told us, the anti-coercion instrument, as promised, was already adopted, plus the Commission adopted some other instruments, such as the Forest Subsidies Regulation, the International Procurement Instrument, and so on and so forth. Since 2021, as all of you commonly know, the context has considerably worsened. I wouldn't say completely shifted, because some of the old concerns are still there, like climate change, digital transformation, global uncertainty, and geopolitical tension. The 2021 Trade Policy Review, of course, was adopted in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, which fortunately is still not in place. However, if we look at the geopolitical context, it worsened considerably with the Russian war, the second term of US President Trump, including threatening with tariffs, and not only, potentially also with force, to buy Greenland, and the EU being in the position to protect itself. So the global context has eroded further, and the question arises whether the motto of open, sustainable, assertive trade policy is still the one fit for the context. To answer this question, in my paper, I look especially into highly publicized actions and agreements, especially adopted or taken in the past year, that question maybe this motto. And in order to answer the question, I look at actions and agreements from a multilateral perspective, then bilateral perspective, and finally conclude. So the first agreement that I looked into from a multilateral perspective is the Turnberry deal. So in April 2025, the US administration announced reciprocal tariffs, and after a row of reciprocal threats to impose further tariffs, in August 2025, the US and EU reached the Turnberry deal in Scotland, which is called deal because it can hardly be called an agreement due to the fact that it's not an agreement per se. Still, the parties engaged and promised the EU on its side to lower its tariff on all industrial goods to zero, to offer preferential market access for certain seafood and agricultural products, and also made some procurement and investment commitments. The US, on the other hand, simply promised not to raise their tariffs higher than 15% on most of EU goods, cars included. Since the parties offered to each other more preferential treatment than the treatment offered to third parties, the agreement clearly breaches the most favored nation principle enshrined in Article 1.1 of the GATT, unless it is justified under Article 24 GATT. That allows parties to sign free trade agreements. However, even some of the EU officials themselves, even the INTA committee, has conceded that the Turnberry deal does not comply with the Article 24 conditions. Why so? Because first of all, Article 24.8b requires parties to eliminate substantially all the duties and other restrictive regulations of commerce on substantially all the trade, which, however, in case of the Ternary deal cannot be the case due to the fact that it's very much unilateral, with the EU lowering its tariff and the US actually maintaining, or even we could say if comparing to the pre-reciprocal tariffs level, actually having higher tariffs of 15%. Furthermore, in order for a measure to be justified under Article 24 GATT, according to the jurisprudence, the tariff should be necessary for the formation of the FTA. Clearly, a 15% tariff was not necessary for the formation of an FTA. As I could say, we could even say that the Ternary deal is rolling back on the members' rights, which cannot be justified. Some have tried to argue that the Ternary deal could be considered as an interim agreement. However, for that, Article 24 prescribes that there should be a plan or schedule leading to the formation of an FTA, which has not happened. And lastly, as a final argument, Article 24.4, which does not establish an obligation per se, informs the interpretation of the rest of the paragraphs of Article 24 and talks about voluntary agreements. So some could even argue that Ternary deal might not even be a voluntary agreement, considering the level of coercion exercised on it. However, we have seen the EU having an anti-coercion instrument and not using it, so maybe the EU itself didn't perceive it as coercion. Another instance from a multilateral perspective that I look into is the EU MFN reform proposal. Of course, some could say the EU MFN reform proposal is very much in line with what has been promised. The Commission said that it's going to pursue WTO reform. It's also going to act more assertively in defending its right, and it will do so with the EU MFN reform proposal. However, this proposal came right after the US one, seemingly supporting the US narrative. And some might even say that the MFN is a bedrock principle, and challenging the FTA, the MFN principle, might be perceived as challenging the WTO itself, especially if we do not look at the MFN reform proposal like separately, but if we look at it together with the Ternary deal. So the two parties that signed the Ternary deal that actually doesn't clearly violate the MFN principle also want to reform the MFN principle. The US has been claiming that the MFN has been constantly breached by other countries. So some could say that maybe there is a clear subsequent practice which could be certainly a means of interpretation according to public international rules. However, of course, subsequent practice cannot completely modify a rule, plus there needs to be the practice needs to be accepted by all parties, at least accepted, which the WTO documents show that it's clearly not the case. So when assessed together the Ternary deal, the EU MFN reform proposal could also be perceived as contradicting the EU's commitment to openness, and also potentially also the assertiveness, since, as we said, the anti-coercion instrument was not used, and instead, in case of the Ternary deal, instead of using the anti-coercion instrument, the EU preferred to sign the deal. From a bilateral perspective, I have been looking at especially at the enforcement of TSD commitments. So in the 2022 TSD review, it was promised that the TSD enforcement, which traditionally takes separately through cooperative mechanisms, will be aligned further with the general dispute settlement mechanism. And if we look at some agreements like EU-New Zealand and EU-Australia, which are agreements signed with like-minded parties, that is indeed the case. So TSD disputes, trade and sustainable development disputes, are going to be subject to the same general dispute settlement mechanism as other FTA disputes. However, if you look into other agreements, such as EU-Mercosur, the EU-Mercosur adopts the same cooperative mechanism that has been traditionally included by the EU in its agreements prior to the 2022 TSD review. If you look into EU-India agreement, we could even say that not only the EU has failed to adopt a more ambitious approach, it actually backtracked on its promise and has included only consultations at different levels in case of TSD disputes. So what we see here that the EU has been pretty much flexible and very open to sign different bilateral agreements. Also, if we look into the 2022 TSD review, the Commission said that it's going to make use of essential elements clause as a basis for sanctions, which allow the parties, in case of a violation of a provision that is seen as essential to the accomplishment of the object or purpose of the treaty, and in that case, the termination or partial suspension of the treaty is allowed. And indeed, the EU has been included essential elements clauses since the EU-UK agreement, especially with respect to the Paris Agreement, and particularly when acts and omissions could materially defeat the object and purpose of the Paris Agreement. The EU-Australia also includes as an essential clause the violation of ILO Fundamental Convention, and we see that in case of these agreements, indeed, the essential elements clauses have been used, and once again, these agreements are signed with like-minded partners. In EU and Mercosur case, there is indeed an essential elements clause with respect to Paris Agreement, but it only mentions that each party shall remain a party in good faith. So it does not address the implementation in good faith of the Paris Agreement. And if we look into the EU-India agreement, there is no essential elements clause whatsoever, be it with respect to climate or labor commitments. So once again, the EU has adopted a very flexible approach with respect to free trade agreements, depending on the partners that it has been concluded agreements with. Finally, from my perspective, I think the EU should not only follow with what it has promised to do, but it also should not adopt or include some mechanisms that could undermine what it has already done. From that perspective, I have been looking also into bilateral rebalancing mechanisms, which are mechanisms included in EU free trade agreements, and not only, that allow the imposition of temporary remedies in case of nullification or impairment of a party's right, even without a violation, and in case a temporary mutually satisfactory adjustment has not been agreed between the parties. This mechanism has also been included in EU-UK agreement. However, in that case, it was a specific case, given the regulatory similarity between the parties and high standards. So in fact, in that case, the mechanism had the purpose to safeguard that high standard. The WTO has also the possibility to, or intrenes the possibility for the WTO members to make use of the non-violation claims since the GATT 1947. But in that case, the non-violation claims are possible only against unforeseeable measures that could have not been expected when the agreement was concluded. If we look, however, into other agreements, for example, the EU-Mercosur agreement, it enshrines the possibility to make use of non-violation claims, or so-called the bilateral rebalancing mechanism, including against measures that are defined as potential, so legislation that has not been fully implemented at the conclusion of the negotiations, potentially also targeted CBAM and the EUDR. So it could be that simply by imposing these measures, even without violating FTA rules, the EU could be subject to either paying a compensation to Mercosur parties or to actually be the subject of some trade remedies from, or sanctions from the Mercosur countries. What is also interesting to see is that after the EU-Mercosur agreement, the same rebalancing mechanisms can be found in EU-India free trade agreement. So apparently it also inspired other parties to look into including the same mechanism in their agreements. However, at least in case of the EU-India FTA, the definition of measure is not as broad in case of Mercosur agreement, and it's likely to be interpreted as in case of the WTO law. So it's probably, and as it seems, the WTO interpretations are also going to be applicable with respect to EU-India norms, and it's likely to cover only foreseeable measures. So at least with respect to CBAM and EUDR, maybe it will not affect. However, there could also be mechanisms that could be used with respect to potential future instruments that were not foreseeable. So to conclude, at least in the recent year, and of course the instances that I presented today are not the sole ones, do not fully achieve what was initially promised, since if we look at some instances solely, like for example the EU-Australia or solely the EU-MFN reform, it might be perceived as actually following with the promise. However, if we analyze them all together, some aspects are more questionable, like the multilateral openness is questionable, but we see an increased bilateral openness. It also, I think, it sends the message internally and externally that EU is ready to renounce some of its commitments, like, for example, commitment to sustainability, or to more assertively enforce its sustainability rights, have been actually so renounced in favor to be able to reach agreements, considering the geopolitical context. Of course, it is to be analyzed against that. So some could say that the EU has found a new flexibility. Some could perceive it as lack of decisiveness and being more assertive in defending its traditional values. Of course, that is also without regard with respect to EU's commitment towards multilateralism under its constitutional treaties, but that has been out of scope of my paper. So to conclude, I would say that the motto, open, sustainable, and assertively, no longer fits the reality, at least in the past year. So maybe, or perhaps it's time for a new one. Thanks.